I think the professionals are after the best equipment they can get their hands on. When we're talking about irons, that's really leading to a forged club. Forged clubs generally are going to be a lot more precise, a lot more consistent. So if you pick up 2 5-irons, for example, they're going to look identical. The forging process is a lot more precise than casting a club. If you ask any of the tour players why they use forged clubs, they'll say that it's the control over the ball, it's a control of the distance, it's a control of the trajectory, the whole flight, the spin control, getting the ball as near to the pin as possible. When you cast a club, it's a much cheaper process, first of all. The idea is that with molten metal you pour that into a mould, so many clubs can be made at the same time. So the liquid metal is poured into the mould. The downside of that is that you end up with air bubbles and other impurities in the head, which lead to inconsistencies in the head weights, hot spots on the face and that type of thing. So basically they're going to be more inconsistent than a forged club. When we look at the cost of producing a head, a forged head, the way we make them to our tolerances, is going to cost 2 to 3 times what some cast clubs cost. Other manufacturers claim that their clubs are forged. They might not be as precise as ours. Some of them may be called form forged, where basically they're cast and then they're sort of squashed after. It's a totally different process. We produce 2 moulds for each individual head, so we have a primary forging, then a secondary forging to get those heads as precise as possible, to leave as little hand grinding as need be on there to keep them consistent from head to head. We include the precision process, which is the secondary mould, so each individual head we have 2 moulds for, again to keep them as consistent as we can. We get the final forging absolutely spot on, the final shape, with very little hand grinding needed. Some other companies only use 1 set of moulds for each individual head. Now that way there's a lot more hand grinding needed, they're going to be inconsistent, they're going to be different weights. It's hard to get that the head weight absolutely correct from the start. Some companies will avoid the secondary forging or the precision forging stage just to avoid the cost, to keep the cost down as low as possible. We don't look at cutting costs, we look at making the best clubs that we can possibly make. We want to forge from 1 piece of metal to keep them consistent again. If you talk about some companies where they're welding on hosels or necks, that's going to lead to inconsistencies. There's weld lines there. You can see when the heads are x-rayed that it's clearly made of 2 parts. It's going to lead to inconsistencies. In our R&D department, we take a lot of notice of what our competition is doing, so we can keep ahead of them. We've seen these 2-piece forgings. I've bent some on the workshop here and seen even at worst case a little crack between the 2 pieces. If you've had to bend them 3 or 4 degrees, for example, you can definitely tell. With a cast club, it really depends on the quality of the casting, and yeah, there are different qualities there. With a top end casting, you can probably move them 3 or 4 degrees if you need to. With a grain flow forged club, you can almost bend them as out of the range of what a golfer would need. Obviously you're going to get a slight mark on the neck, maybe because they're softer, but they're a lot more pliable. You can bend them around, they'll stay there, they won't move back. With some of the cheaper castings, the metal is very hard and therefore very brittle. You can try bending them, they won't move at all. If you force them a little bit more, they'll just snap in 2, which isn't much use to anyone. Well, I think back then most forged clubs were actually in the form of a blade. So quite rightly, they probably were harder to use. A lot of the cast clubs were cavity back, so therefore more forgiving. You can move the weight around a lot more than in a blade design. So yeah, a lot more, they were easier to use. It certainly isn't the case now. The technology has moved on tremendously from then. We can now make forged clubs with real large cavity back designs to them. We can mill cavities into the back of the club as well from a forging to move that weight as low and deep as we possibly can in a forging, which is pretty much comparable to a cast design.